Hey guys, tonight we're going to start with a single bucket of human waste tossed casually from a second-story window into a muddy medieval street, and somehow, by the end of the night, we'll be tracing that very splash all the way to the modern systems that inspect your drinking water, regulate your toothpaste, and decide how often your local restaurant's bathroom gets cleaned. You probably wouldn't expect that the grossest habits of medieval townspeople who thought soap was suspicious, and that washing too often might invite the devil, would lay the groundwork for public health policies, sewer systems, and even epidemiology. But here we are. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake by the end, post your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a narrow cobblestone alley in 14th century London. The smell hits first. A ripe, rotting stew of urine, fish bones, sweat, beer, and something vaguely horse-like. The source? Everywhere. Waste piles up along the street edges. Chamber pots are dumped from above. You hear a warning cry, "Gardaloo," which is the only protection the pedestrians below get before being rained on by. Well, let's not describe it too graphically. But it's this exact moment, this ordinary, disgusting act, that kicks off our chain reaction. At this point in history, cities are exploding in size. People are crammed into tight urban quarters, and personal hygiene is considered more of a spiritual matter than a bodily one. Bathing too often is frowned upon, especially after public bathhouses fall under suspicion for harboring sinful behavior. And so, with fewer people bathing and more people living together, cities start to reek. Interestingly, the stench isn't just unpleasant, it's political. Merchants and minor nobility complain that the smell offends their dignity. Laws begin appearing, not about washing, but without local surveillance. Cities start hiring watchers. These early sanitary officers don't carry mops or gloves. Their job is to document infractions. Who's dumping waste at illegal hours, who's letting their animals defecate in public walkways, and which fishmongers are leaving spoiled stock out too long. It's all about order, about smell, visibility, and shame. Historians still argue whether these early sanitation fines were about health at all, if they were just a tool for the ruling classes to flex control over the crowded poor. But that first chamber pot, it's no longer just waste. It's a catalyst for record-keeping, urban surveillance, and the earliest attempts to manage the chaos of shared city life. And here's your first connecting thread. The enforcement of anti-smell laws required written documentation, and from there, city officials began keeping ledgers. Ledgers led to patterns, and patterns, as we'll soon see, are what allow us to spot disease outbreaks. That's the stink of progress beginning to rise. You move through the city now, not as a visitor, but as a resident. The year is 1351, and you're wedged between a tannery and a tavern. Your nose never quite adjusts. You step carefully, not just to avoid the filth in the gutters, but because a slip might mean tumbling into something far worse than mud. Still, you're starting to notice something new. Structure. Those overflowing gutters, they've been rerouted slightly. Some streets even have shallow channels open, air drainage, ditches designed to funnel waste away from shop fronts. They don't work well, but the intent is there. And that intent is municipal. You see, when the smell became too much, even for the nobles especially, during summer banquets or processions, they began to demand cleaner streets. Not out of compassion for the common folk, of course, but because odor was starting to signify disorder, and disorder threatened authority. So councils formed. Laws were copied between cities. A 14th century London ordinance reads like a grumpy parent's scolding. No person shall cast dung, garbage, entrails, or other filth into the common road. Meanwhile, in Florence, citizens were fined for keeping pigs too close to walkways. In Lübeck, open latrines near markets were condemned. These weren't centralized health policies, not yet. They were patchy, arbitrary, and deeply classist. But they pushed one crucial idea, that the layout of the city could affect how people lived, and that idea, filth, as a symptom of mismanagement, would reshape cities for centuries to come through trash heaps and remove the worst of it. But they often sold what they collected, rotting rags, bones, or old food, back into secondary markets. So in a strange way, waste management turned into a kind of economy. Historians still debate whether these early systems were inspired by genuine concern for the public or just the complaints of wealthy households tired of dodging dung. But one thing is clear. The layout of cities began shifting to accommodate sanitation. That's your connecting thread. Streets were redesigned. Buildings pulled back from alleys. Drainage became a city-wide conversation. And once you start redesigning a city around healthier, at least smell, you've laid the blueprint for modern urban planning. And guess what? Those blueprints will eventually be used to track disease. But for now, they're just trying to keep the rot from reaching the front door. You're now inside a public bathhouse barefoot on damp tiles, the steam curling around wooden beams and candlelight flickering against the walls. The year is 1220, and for a brief moment in medieval Europe, bathing is trendy. Not everywhere, of course, but across parts of the Holy Roman Empire, northern Italy, and even England, bathhouses are flourishing, but not for long. You notice something changing in the air, not the steam, but the judgment. A local bishop has issued a warning. Public bathing, he claims, leads to vanity, and worse. Whispers spread that too much cleanliness invites sinful behavior, because bathhouses are mixed. Gender in some regions and not always strictly regulated. They become associated with brothels, pagan rituals, and temptation. Suddenly, washing is suspect. The turning point comes slowly. As the church's influence deepens, spiritual purity becomes prioritized over bodily purity. Monks argue that invisible filth sinneth the greater danger. And so, physical grime becomes weirdly virtuous, even holy. Saints are praised for how rarely they bathe. One monk brags of not washing his feet for decades. You step outside the bathhouse and realize it's closing, not because it's unsafe, but because it's morally dangerous, and that moral danger spreads. Entire cities shutter their communal bathhouses. In some, ironically, to stay healthy, people begin avoiding water entirely. But here's the twist. With bathhouses closed and washing stigmatized, cities get filthier. And when things get filthier, they get sicker. That's when a new kind of record-keeping emerges. Clergy begin noting illness patterns among their congregants. Town scribes start documenting pestilences in the margins of civic records. In avoiding the water, society unintentionally sharpens its eye on disease. There's your connecting thread. Spiritual suspicion toward bathing leads to urban dirtiness, which in turn forces cities to observe and eventually track patterns of illness. And, as you'll soon see, those observations will someday become epidemiology. The year is 1348, and you're not just watching history, you're inhaling it. The stench of death clings to everything. Rats dart through gutters. Bells toll endlessly. People wear beaked masks stuffed with herbs, hoping to ward off the miasmath, bad air, believed to carry the plague. You've arrived in the heart of the Black Death. In just a few years, Europe loses nearly 1/3 of its population. Entire villages are abandoned. Fields lie fallow. Trade slows to a crawl. And still, bodies pile up faster than they can be buried. You stand beside a trench outside Florence, watching as carts unload the dead like firewood. But here's where it gets interesting. Amid the chaos, order starts to form. Cities respond in desperation. Of course, but their efforts leave an unexpected legacy. In Milan, infected houses are walled, shut, literally bricked in. In Venice, ships are forced to wait offshore for 40 days of practice. That becomes known as quarantino. Quarantine. And for the first time in recorded European history, cities begin issuing health directives in writing. Florence creates a rudimentary board of health. Dubrovnik establishes plague inspectors. And though their methods are primitive, burning clothes, isolating the sick, they represent something revolutionary. The idea that disease can be prevented, not just endured. Historians still debate how effective these early measures were, but they agree on this. The idea of civic responsibility in illness management, however flawed, was born here. And there's your connecting thread. The plague, fueled by medieval filth and flawed beliefs about hygiene, forces cities to adopt systematic responses. It's the moment when sickness becomes a civic concern, not just divine punishment or personal misfortune. From now on, when people get sick, cities will keep notes. And from those notes will come models. You're now crouched in a dim alley behind a butcher's stall, watching a man in a ragged coat carefully set a wooden box against a wall. It's moving. Incinerats. A lot of them. You've met one of the many unlicensed rat catchers who work the cities now, not for wages, but for coin, blackmail, or even entertainment. By the late 1500s, the urban rat has become a fact of life. And where rats go, disease follows. But what starts as an unregulated job, more street trickster than civil servant, soon takes on greater importance. In places like Paris, London, and Antwerp, the sheer scale of vermin becomes unmanageable. Authorities begin hiring rat catchers officially. Some even wear identifiable uniforms. These early pest control agents record their catches, report infestations, and occasionally act as snitches for local governments. That's when something unexpected happens. To justify their pay, rat catchers start counting numbers of rats, nests, burrows. Their notes are crude, but city officials start comparing them with illness reports. And little by little, a pattern begins to emerge. Where rat sightings spike, plague cases tend to follow. Still, not everyone buys it. Many cling to miasma theory, blaming foul vapors rather than fleas or rodents. But these simple logs, rat numbers, locations, frequency, plant a seed. The idea that data might reveal the shape of an epidemic. You watch one young inspector scratch his observations into a leather-bound book, completely unaware that he's laying the groundwork for contact tracing centuries before the term exists. There's a quirky fringe tidbit for you. In some cities, especially during outbreaks, rat catchers were required to wear belso. Citizens could avoid them, fearing the dead rodents they carried. Historians still argue whether these early efforts were scientific or just superstitious bookkeeping. But one thing's clear. For the first time, animal behavior and urban disease are being tracked together. And here's your connecting thread. To control pestilence, cities begin employing people who observe, report, and analyze physical signs in the environment. From that practice will come a startling innovation: health surveillance. The plague may have killed millions, but it also gave cities eyes. You step into a 17th century soapmaker's workshop in Amsterdam. The room smells sharp and bitter animal fat boiled with ashes and lime. Thick steam clings to the ceiling beams. Nearby, wrapped in brown paper, are cakes of soft, grayish soap. They're expensive, luxurious, almost suspiciously clean. That suspicion, oddly enough, will turn out to be a powerful political tool. As soap spreads across Europe, especially among elites, it becomes more than just a hygiene product. It's a status symbol. Royal courts commission perfumed varieties. Nobility begin boasting of their bathing habits. And where the upper classes go, rules tend to follow. By the early 1000s, 700s, monarchs and city officials begin weaving cleanliness into the language of power. To be clean is to be civilized. To be clean is to be loyal. French kings demand that their court physicians inspect barbershops and bathhouses. In Prussia, schools are ordered to enforce student washing routines. What started as a luxury is now a standard and expectation. Those who fail to meet it are labeled dangerous, untrustworthy, even subversive. You now find yourself inside a modest tenement. A government inspector raps at the door, enters without waiting, and examines the shared water basin in the courtyard. He notes the condition of the floor, the state of the waste bucket, and of course, whether the children are washed. Why? Because hygiene is becoming a proxy for morality. And here's the odd twist. Governments realize that they can use hygiene inspections as a way to control behavior. Clean people follow orders. Dirty people rebel. Or so the thinking goes. Here's a strange side fact. In 18th century Vienna, soap was briefly taxed as a luxury item, but then made mandatory in hospitals and prisons. So, it was simultaneously a privilege and a requirement. Historians still argue whether these shifts were about protecting citizens or policing them. But there's your connecting thread. Cleanliness becomes policy, and policy requires inspection. The soap in your hand is no longer just soap. It's the precursor to public health audits, government campaigns, and even propaganda posters. The clean state becomes the watching state. Now you're walking the sewers of 19th century Paris, but not through mud and waste. This time, you're gliding above a crisp, detailed map. A map drawn in exacting hand, folded into a leather-bound city ledger, and stored in the municipal archives. This map-just paper and ink will help save tens of thousands of lives. Let's rewind a little. Mid-1800s Paris is bursting at the seams. Its medieval sewer lines, designed centuries ago, can't keep up with modern waste. Streets overflow. Water is tainted. Cholera outbreaks become annual horrors. In 1832, one epidemic kills nearly 20. 0 Parisians in just a few months. Enter engineer Eugène Belgrand. Tasked with modernizing the city's underground arteries, Belgrand creates one of the most detailed sanitation maps ever attempted. Every pipe, drain, junction, and slope is drawn, not just to plan improvements, but to understand the city's hidden flows. And here's the butterfly moment. When cholera returns in 1854, officials use Belgrand's map not just to fix blockages but to trace infection paths. They begin noting where outbreaks start, which neighborhoods report early symptoms, how those zones connect to the sewer grid. The invisible becomes visible. A pattern emerges. Sound familiar? John Snow would apply in London. When he traced a cholera outbreak to a water pump on Broad Street, except Paris had a head start, thanks to its blueprint of filth. A fringe detail. Belgrand's redesigned sewers were so impressive, they became a tourist attraction. Visitorious, in actual carriages rode through tunnels beneath the city just to marvel at the cleanliness. Historians still debate whether these innovations were driven by humanitarian concern or bourgeois anxiety about smell and proximity to the poor. But what's undeniable is this. The sewer map becomes a disease map. And here's your connecting thread. Once you can see how waste moves, you can see how sickness moves. From that realization will come tracing apps, outbreak zones, and even lockdown perimeters. The street above may be dirty, but beneath it, modern public health is drawing its first lines. You're standing in the parlor of a Victorian philanthropist's home. Lace curtains, a china tea set, and, curiously, a poster pinned neatly to the wall that reads, "Cleanliness is next to godliness." This isn't just decoration, it's part of a movement. By the late 1800s, Britain is in full-blown hygiene panic. Industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and London are choking on soot, sewage, and slums. Reformers, many of them wealthy women or clergymen, begin crusading not for political revolution but for soap, towels, and airflow. And so, the cleanliness movement is born. At first glance, it seems noble. Volunteers visit tenement families and teach them how to scrub, launder, and open windows. Public bathhouses reappear, now heavily regulated. Clean streets, clean homes, clean bodies, it all seems simple. But you start noticing a darker undertone. The movement isn't just about health, it's about morality. Reformers divide neighborhoods into deserving clean and dangerously dirty. Poverty is seen not as misfortune, but as a hygiene failure. Architecture respond. You watch as cities redesign working-class housing. Wider streets, larger windows, and shared laundry facilities, but also surveillance points, fenced parks, and clear lines of separation between classes. Cleanliness becomes a visual language of virtue and a justification for controlling public space. Here's a quirky bit. One reformer insisted that city benches be curved, not flat so no one could lie down. Even hygiene could be weaponized. Historians still argue whether Victorian reformers improved lives or imposed middle-class values on the poor. But the data is real. After their redesigns, mortality rates drop. Child survival rates rise. Sanitation saves lives 7 if the motivations were complicated. And there's your connecting thread. Obsession with moral cleanliness leads to architectural shifts that reshape cities into machines of surveillance and order. From these restructured urban spaces, we'll soon get school inspections, hospital hygiene ratings, and even your workplace restroom policy. You've bathed your way into bureaucracy. Now you're hunched over a wrinkled sheet of parchment in a candlelit room, watching a man draw tiny circles across a city map. Each one marks a death. You're in 1854 London, and the man's name is John Snownot, the one with the sword, but the one with the water pump. This is the moment when numbers defeat superstition. For centuries, disease had been blamed on vague notions, bad smells, moral decay, divine wrath. But Jon Snow suspects something else, something very specific. He believes that the cholera outbreak ravaging Soho isn't caused by miasma, but by contaminated drinking water. So, he walks, and counts, and maps, house by house, death by death, until one pump on Broad Street emerges as the clear culprit. You're watching the birth of data visualization in public health. And here's the kicker. Snow convinces local officials to remove the pump handle. Cholera cases drop dramatically. It's not just a win for logists, it's a shift in mindset. The invisible becomes measurable. Meanwhile, you see another figure, Florence Nightingale, drawing rose-shaped charts to show how poor hygiene in military hospitals kills more soldiers than bullets. Her visuals, stun parliament. Policy changes follow. Here's a quirky detail. Nightingale's graphs were hand-colored with watercolor to make them more persuasive. Science meet aesthetics. Historians still debate how quickly Snow's theories were accepted. Many clung to miasma theory for decades, but his Mathis circle set a new precedent, that patterns could prove cause. And here's your connecting thread. From gross medieval gutters and suspicious bathhouses, we've now arrived at modern epidemiology. The act of tracking illness through mapped data initiated in a filthy city becomes the cornerstone of disease control. It's the reason you get health alerts, the reason pandemic curves are graphed, the reason hospitals run simulations. It all starts with a dot on a map, centuries of stink. You're standing at the edge of a wide river, now modern, chlorinated, safe. Children play nearby. Joggers pass with earbuds in. A sign warns not to litter. And a sanitation worker in a neon vest nods as he rolls his cart past you. This is the clean world. But it's not just the result of compassion or science. It's also the product of fear. In the early 20th century, cities across Europe and North America began implementing wide-scale public health programs. Water testing, sewer expansion, garbage collection, and food inspection. But these weren't purely altruistic moves. They were often motivated by the panic of the wealthy. When typhoid struck, politicians responded fastest in districts with mansions. When cholera reappeared, water purification began out in poor neighborhoods first, but wherever rich households were downhill. The logic was simple and selfish. Filth flows, and if the lower classes stayed dirty, the upper classes stayed vulnerable. So, cities invested in filtering stations. They chlorinated municipal supplies. They required restaurant inspections. And they built entire health departments to enforce these new, invisible boundaries of safety. Here's a strange tidbit. In some US cities, water fountains were color-coded not just for race, but to distinguish between filtered and unfiltered supply lines, depending on neighborhood income. Historians still argue how much of modern sanitation policy was driven by sincere reform versus elite protectionism. But the effect remains. Your tap water is tested, your local pool is regulated, your favorite restaurant is graded, and your toothpaste? Approved by at least 3 separate agencies. And here's your final connecting thread. The disgust once directed at chamber pots and overflowing alleys becomes institutionalized as policy. Filth is no longer just a nuisance. It's a governable threat. You began tonight with a bucket dumped in a medieval alley. Now, you live in a world where entire departments exist to prevent that splash from ever reaching you. It's been a long, winding trail of stink butt. That trail has shaped everything from your city layout to your sink. So now, as you sit quietly, maybe already drifting towards sleep, let's just take a moment to trace the strange, soggy footsteps we followed tonight. It all started with something simple, something gross. Sure but ordinary for its time. A chamber pot tossed into the street. That single splash, echoing through a narrow medieval alley, led us through centuries of avoidance, overcorrection, invention, fear, and finally, systemization. We watched how disgust shaped cities, how avoidance of bathing became a moral stance, how panic over plague gave rise to laws, boards, maps, and jobs, how rats helped birth surveillance, how soap became a symbol, and how stench simple, visceral, undeniable forced cities to listen to their bodies before they even understood bacteria. You might not think of your local plumbing, your filtered faucet, or that quiet monthly inspection notice as results of medieval filth, but they are. Each quiet policy and protective habit traces back to centuries when people finally said, enough. We need to fix this. That's the magic of the butterfly effect. It doesn't always flap dramatically. Sometimes it squelches underfoot, unnoticed, unwanted, but persistent. So as you settle deeper into your pillow, let your mind fade from the narrow alleys of 14th century London to the quiet hum of pipes in the walls around you. The world is cleaner now. Not perfect, but undeniably better. Thanks to people who couldn't stand the smell one more day. Rest easy. The sewer maps are drawn, the inspectors are on duty, and the pipes, thankfully, are doing their job.